Broadcast on Moneycontrol. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is in Washington meeting US President Donald Trump. It's probably the most consequential visit by an Indian Prime Minister to Washington, the most important meeting in trade terms between an Indian Prime Minister and a US President. It will have a huge amount of implications for both the Indian economy and for a large part of global trade. So what we're going to do here today is to decode what this means for India, what it means for global trade, and what it means for our economy. And we have Amityendu Palit, Senior Fellow in the Institute of South Asian Studies and at the National University of Singapore, also the Research Lead for Trade and Tariffs. Amityendu has been tracking trade, tariffs and the global economy for over 20 years now. Amityendu, thanks very much for joining us and for making time for us from Singapore. Shruti Pandale joins us from the Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, tracks the defense relationship and the bilateral relationship. So Shruti, thanks very much for joining us on Moneycontrol early this morning. And Parikshit Luthra, Chief of Bureau at CNBC, joins us from Washington. Parikshit has been following the Prime Minister around in Washington, and he's going to give us a ground sense. Parikshit, thanks very much. I know it's late night in Washington, and thanks very much for making the time. Sanjeev Shankaran, our senior editor, is joining us from Bangalore, and Ishan Gera, who tracks data for us, and the economy, is also joining us here. So let me first start with Parikshit. Parikshit, we've had a joint press briefing from the Prime Minister and the President. It was preceded by Trump talking about reciprocal tariffs. I think he's eased a lot of fears by not implementing them immediately, but there was some saber rattling there where he said, okay, we are going to impose this, but there will be a report that will be made over the next couple of months, and then a decision will be taken. That was the prelude to this press conference. Let's quickly take a look, if our producers can roll, let's quickly take a look at what President Trump said on tariffs and Narendra Modi's response on it before we get to Parikshit to get a sense of what exactly has been happening.
As we deepen our defense partnership, we'll also strengthen our economic ties and bring greater fairness and reciprocity to our trading relationship. As a signal of good faith, Prime Minister Modi recently announced the reductions to India's unfair, very strong tariffs that limit U.S. access into the Indian market very strongly, and really it's a big problem, I must say. India imposes a 30 to 40 to 60 and even 70% tariff on so many of the goods, and in some cases far more than that. And as an example, a 70% tariff on U.S. cars going into India, which makes it pretty much impossible to sell those cars. Today, the U.S. Trade deficit with India is almost $100 billion, and Prime Minister Modi and I have agreed that we'll begin negotiations to address the long-running disparities that should have been taken care of over the last 4 years, but they didn't do that in the U.S.-India trading relationship, with the goal of signing an agreement. And we want, we want a certain level playing field, which we really think we're entitled to, and he does also, in fairness. So we're going to work on that very hard, and we can make up the difference very easily with the deficit, with the sale of oil and gas, LNG, of which we have more than anybody in the world.
Right. So that was President Trump talking earlier this morning. So Parikshit, when it's Donald Trump and Narendra Modi, things move on fast forward, and there's been a barrage of announcements. The top five, really. The first is that the announcement that India-US trade will double up to $500 billion by 2030. The Prime Minister's statement that Make India Great Again plus Make America Great Again is equal to a mega partnership for development. He equated Viksit Bharat to Make India Great Again. There is the announcement on defense, which Trump said that India is going to buy a lot more of defense armaments and the F-35s. I know you asked the question to Vikram Misri after if India has actually made that deal or not. Trump has also announced that oil and gas exports to India, exports by India from the US are going to increase substantially. Very importantly, the decision to extradite Tawazzur Rana, key accused in the 2611 to India. Also talk about the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor and on Islamic terror. So what are you hearing? You were at the press conference just now, Parikshit, with Vikram Misri. What are you hearing? What is the Indian delegation telling you off the record? Did India get what we wanted?
Well, we are saying that this was a very substantive visit and high on outcomes. Clearly, there was pressure in the room, tension in the room with regard to tariffs. Imagine you're sitting next to Donald Trump with a room full of media, and you have Donald Trump saying that you treat us badly, you're a very high tariff country. We've not been able to sell Harley-Davidson motorcycles in the past in India. Electric vehicle makers in America are not able to sell cars in India because the duties are as high as 70%. So Trump made all attempts to push the Indian side in a corner. He also announced those reciprocal tariffs, even though they don't mean anything immediately, because first a study has to be conducted on sector to sector, country to country tariffs, and then a decision would be taken. But clearly the move was to put pressure on India and corner them. However, we have given them concessions. In fact, Vikram Misri saying in the press conference that India's energy imports from US alone were $15 billion in 2024, and this could well go up to $25 billion in the near future. So that was a big announcement that our energy imports from the US could be $25 billion. Our trade deficit itself is $35 to $40 billion. On the defense front, F-35s, clearly attempts by Donald Trump to possibly jump the gun and force India to buy F-35s or maybe move quickly on a proposal that India and US are considering. But Vikram Misri clarified that this is not something that's going to happen overnight. There is a formal process that has to take place. India has to issue a RFP as well. None of that has happened, and all those steps have to be completed before any kind of deal can be formalized. But I must point out, I'm looking at the outcome document right now, the joint statement which has been issued, and it speaks about the procurement of 6 additional P-8I maritime patrol aircraft following agreement of sale terms. It also speaks about US announcing a review of its policy on releasing 5th generation fighters and undersea systems to India. So clearly, defense and energy were the low-hanging fruit, and there are some commitments, immediate commitments, that we will see in a way working out in the next 7 to 8 months. On a trade deal, both leaders have agreed to tell their respective governments to go back to the drawing board, have a limited multi-sector trade deal by the fall of this year. So when Donald Trump would come for the Quad Summit, both leaders will go down and sign that limited trade deal, which will address concerns of both sides. Now, our sources were telling us that what Prime Minister Modi conveyed to Donald Trump, that it's not just US companies which are having market access issues, even Indian companies have market access issues. We conveyed that when it comes to trade, don't expect any trade agreement to be a one-way street. It cannot be only about America great again. It has to be a win-win partnership. So that was something that Prime Minister Modi emphasized. He also spoke about overcapacity in China and how that dumping is hurting economies like United States and India, and how any trade deal must take concerted action against Chinese dumping as well.
Parikshit, what do you make of the body language and the bro love there? Trump saying that Modi is a tougher negotiator than him. Modi saying, well, Trump has got a copyright on the word deal. What do you make of the body language and the kind of bonhomie between the two? Because Vikram Misri was also talking about that in his press conference.
Definitely, that was very visible. I was at White House through the day, and I was also at Blair House, where Mike Waltz, the US NSA, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy spent a lot of time with Prime Minister Narendra Modi. In fact, Nalin, I must point out, I was at Blair House, and Elon Musk was literally there meeting the Prime Minister for 1 hour. We spoke to our sources about what that meeting was all about. They said no commitment on manufacturing from Elon Musk, no commitment on starting retail operations, but they had a discussion about the business environment in India and the prospects of an India-US relationship. So very significant, and maybe we'll see something on Elon Musk in India in the next few months or maybe a year, because 50 minutes is very, very long time in diplomacy. Now, speaking about the body language, since the time the Prime Minister received the honor guard at the White House lawns, how he was escorted inside by Donald Trump. Donald Trump kept referring to him as a good friend. He remembered his relationship with India between 2016 to 20 and said that that was a time we made great strides that was disrupted by the Biden administration, but I want to build on the good partnership we had with India. Prime Minister Modi is a great person, and he is a great negotiator as well. So it seemed that both sides were trying to praise each other, and even during the press conference, the US press was putting a lot of questions to Donald Trump, but at some point Donald Trump said, put your questions to the Indian Prime Minister.
Right. Parikshit, thanks very much for joining us from Washington. Really appreciate the update. So let's try and break this down a little bit more. See, a lot of this is grand announcements. A lot of this, there's a lot of negotiation, hard negotiation that are going to roll out now over the next few months. The US markets are up this morning after we'll see what's going to happen to the Indian markets. But first, let's break this down. Amitendra, I want to come to you, but before that, Ishan is here. Let's break down what does this doubling of trade, or this statement of intent, 500 billion by 2030, what does it mean? The current trade right now, if I remember right, Ishan, is around $190 billion, India-US. The US is also the third largest FDI provider into India, at somewhere around 4.99 billion. There are about 160 companies, Indian companies invested in the US with investments about $40 billion. But India has a trade surplus of about 35 billion. Can you just break down the current state of the export-import relationship and the India-US relationship before we understand what this means from Amitendra?
So, Nalin, this is very interesting. You look at when Trump came in, what happened? This is the trade that you had. 41 billion was what we were exporting and 23 billion was what we were importing from the US. Now, we would discount 2020, which is a pandemic year. This went up by about 25% here and about 40% here. In terms of exports, we were doing about 54 billion, and in terms of imports, we were doing about 36 billion. Now, since then, we have increased again and almost double it in terms of exports. It's gone up to about 81 billion, and imports are about 43 billion here, which shows...
So, in the Biden years, our US exports have really shot up.
Really shot up. Right. Now, when we are talking about a doubling, what we are basically talking about is taking this 120 billion here and making it about 300 billion in terms of your goods exports. Right. And others would come from services, which would be about another 200 billion, taking it to 500 billion. Right. So, that has been.
So let's also break down, just to put some more flesh and blood on this. These are the macro numbers.
These are the macro
what
numbers.
Does this actually mean? Which are the goods that India imports and exports?
So
let's go down to the
why
micro
why is Trump talking about a trade surplus problem? Look at what happened with trade surplus when Trump came in. It was about 19 billion for India. It went to 22 billion in 2020, and then it shot up to 40 billion. Right. So that's what he's concerned about. That why are we paying 40 billion extra?
So India is, if I understand right, in terms of countries that have a trade surplus with the US or which the US has a trade deficit with, India is number 10 on that list.
Yeah, exactly. But if you look at the specifics more, as a percentage of total trade, India falls behind even Indonesia and others who have a trade surplus which is much lower. So you have to look at it. But let's look at what has happened.
This is the important chart.
What has happened to exports, how exports have changed. So 2014, right, if you look at exports, gems and jewelries, mineral fuels, pharmaceutical products, these were our top items. Textiles. Now look at this. Electronics has become the top item here. So with 15.3%.
So electronics here.
Electronics here has become the top
so that's
item.
Basically the Apple phones. I mean, that's one of the big showpiece projects of the Modi government.
7.2% is your smartphones.
Right.
Right. Others are machinery and all. Gems and jewelry is still there. Pharma products has increased. Machineries have increased from India. And you'd be surprised to find out, while we are talking about the defense trade, US is one of the largest importers of defense products from India. And this is mostly parts and electronics, while India has imported over the last decade $15 billion worth of US products.
So hold that thought. Let me bring in Amitendra into this and then Shruti. Amitendra, when you're sitting and looking at this, you've been tracking Indian trade policy for the longest time in the region and globally. What do you make of this? Is this a lot of bluff and bluster, or are we seeing a tectonic shift in the relationship as it stands?
Thank you, Nalin, for having me on the show. I think, Nalin, let me begin by saying the meeting that we just witnessed between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump, it's actually the beginning of a new period of engagement, but that engagement is going to be a complicated engagement. And let's try to bring out the areas of this. On the 20th of January, pretty much soon after President Trump assumed office, there was a policy that was announced, and that was the Make America First trade policy. Now, in that trade policy, it was very clearly mentioned that the use of tariffs and the idea of trade will be brought into the policy space by the United States of America in its external engagement with partners in such a way that it addresses the questions of the United States national security. Now, this is a very important point to note because we have never had an episode where administrations start looking at trade as an element of national security and using trade for addressing national security interests. Now, when we look at the actions that have come from the Trump administration thereafter, so that began from Canada and Mexico tariffs, then it went on to the China tariffs. Canada-Mexico tariffs were put on pause. Now there is a series of reciprocal tariffs for which a roadmap has been announced. The tariffs have not yet been announced, and there are steel and aluminium tariffs that have come. And consistently with respect to India, there is this view coming out that India is not a good place for doing business. India has high tariffs and so on and so forth. And on top of that, parallelly, you see this deal that has come out. It's not exactly a deal, but it's kind of again a roadmap towards a deal, that there could be a limited multi-sectoral trade deal. There could be commitments given to buying more of oil and energy and so on and so forth. I think what has happened out here is that India had to make concessions. There's no denying the fact, because the export and trade relationship with the United States for India is a very important relationship. If you look at India's top 10 trade partners, United States is probably the one which is not just its largest export market, but also one of those countries with whom India does have a trade surplus, and those are important at a point in time when with most other trade partners, India is running a trade deficit, and India's overall trade deficit is pretty large. The question to be looked at, Nalin, is the United States is looking at India as a country with whom, if it can push more oil and gas exports, it will bring down the US trade deficit with India. The question is, what does this mean for India's overall trade deficit? Because India's overall trade deficit is exclusive of the surplus that it had is the United States. Supposing today, if India starts buying more United States oil and gas, let's not forget the fact right now the US is not among the top 5 oil sources for India.
Yeah.
Even a country like
US
Angola
is 6th or 7th,
is
and
much
Russia
larger.
is the biggest supplier of oil to India at the moment. So.
Exactly. And the OPEC countries continue to have the largest share in that oil procurement. The United States oil is going to be priced much more than the rest of the oil that India is buying. So I would actually assume this is a concession that India has made. But that concession needs to be balanced with the fact that where are the other gains that are expected to flow? And my sense is where India will probably be looking to go forward to make much more headway into the Trump presidency as time moves on is number one with respect to the defense relationship and the trade that surrounds the defense relationship. And number two is the question of immigration. I think immigration and H-1B are two vital areas where India would expect to get substantive concessions from the United States. And there's a very important point, Nalin, I think Ishan showed this in the graphs. Let's not forget the fact that the period over which Indian exports have increased to the United States over the last 6 years is a period when India did not have the GSP concession. So that's a very important point to note. It means that Indian exports are essential for the United States. And that is a fact which the United States administration is well aware of. Because over this period, simultaneously, Chinese exports to the United States have gone down, and exports of a number of other countries have increased to the US along with India's. Now, earlier there was a view that India is getting preferential access through the GSP, so its exports would have automatically got into the American market. It's no more the case. So there is a competitive advantage that Indian exports do enjoy in the US market, and this is specifically for machinery and electronics because the export basket is changing.
Right. Right. Amitendra,
Yeah.
just hold that thought. Let me bring in Shruti on this, on the defense relationship. Shruti, we've had talk about the F-35s. The F-35 was on display at the Aero India show this week in Bangalore. There was also the Russian aircraft, the Su-57s as well. India has also bought the Rafales. The F-35 is also a plane which Musk has dissed a year ago, right? Saying that these idiots are talking about manned fighter planes when drones are the way to go. So you've been tracking the defense relationship for the longest time. What is your sense of this? Has India agreed to buy the F-35? Because that will be a major shift in our defense policy in terms of our procurement, and also in terms of our shifting relationship in terms of defense armaments from Russia, because already we've diversified a fair bit from Russia being the primary supplier to now being the biggest one, but France, US, others coming in. But do you think the US component of that going up now?
Hi, Nalin. Thanks very much for having me on your show. Let me begin by saying that, if you heard Foreign Minister Jaishankar talk about, President Trump coming into office and India's ability to manage Trump, there was a sense there's a quite confidence in New Delhi that he'll be able to do so. And at least from the optics of it, what we've managed to see in Washington between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump's meeting, you see that what Prime Minister Modi perhaps thought about doing, which is, to create new avenues of cooperation, manage expectation, and align ecosystems to ensure ties stay the course. That has happened. As far as the defense relationship is concerned, obviously, even before Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington, we heard a lot of news on how Trump administration is going to push arms sales very heavily onto India as one of the big ticket items. And as Parikshit mentioned, the low-hanging fruit of this visit. I feel I agree with Parikshit on the fact that the F-35 announcement is still premature. I think we need to wait for the dust to settle. There's a whole process that's going. We've just sort of sealed the deals on the drones. We've heard a lot of the announcements on the P-81, a lot on the maritime defense acquisition front. Which all line up actually with what India's asks are. As you are aware, India is trying to position itself as a leading power in the Indo-Pacific, where we are saying that we are the first sort of security providers in the neighborhood, and also have aspirations to be part of mechanisms like the Quad, which are looking at collective defense, but with a positive agenda. So having said that, yes, the defense component of the India-US relationship is only set to go. But there are two caveats that Prime Minister Modi perhaps has conveyed during his conversation with President Trump. One, that yes, India will prioritize defense acquisitions, but based on its own ask as to what the military requirements are of the day. And two, that, the arms sales pushing has to, at the end of the day, dovetail with what India is trying to do domestically in terms of the idea of self-reliance and manufacturing within India. And finally, I think if you look at the Biden administration, what the thrust of the defense cooperation really was on technology collaboration. Now you're going to see New Delhi telling Washington, at least behind closed doors, that we're here for the arms sales and we know that these are our requirements and we'll build towards that. But we also need to have guarantees on access to technology. This cannot be a one-way street. So I think that's the way you will see these negotiations pan out up until the Quad summit, where we'll see a lot more announcements.
Because Trump also talked about, I think he also mentioned that India will be changing some laws, especially on the nuclear question and so on. Let me bring in Sanjeev Shankaran. Sanjeev, if Sanjeev, we've lost the connection with Sanjeev at the moment. We'll try and get back to him. Ishan, let's bring it back to the macro picture. See, in terms of the tariff war, because that impacts the whole global economy and not just the India-US relationship. In terms of what India imports from the US, I think the more than 20% is less than 80% of US imports into India are taxed at over 20%, right? So if you can break down where India has to make concessions.
So there are two ways to look at this, and this is very interesting when you look at it. If you look at in terms of value, about 96% of products get less than 20% tariff.
Right.
Right. If you look at just the product lines, that's about 80% get less 20% tariff. The problem that becomes is this ramps up much faster. Right. So when you reach the 20% marks, your tariffs ramp up much faster. Your vehicles, your motorcycles, you remember Harley Davidson was a big issue during last time, right? All those become
And that
big issues.
that has been that was resolved. And even the budget, the government has made some
The
announcements
government
on
has
that.
made some concessions into that part. So that is one area which is a problem. But if you look at it, there's another side to this story. Look at what happens when terms of trade are there for Mexico, Indonesia, China, right? This is the amount of Indian products that account for less than 5% tariff from US. So when India exports, 72% of the goods get less than 5% tariff. China gets more concessions, Indonesia gets more concessions, and that's why probably Trump is saying Modi is a tough negotiator.
So in other words, there is enough room for give and take here, where both sides, it's a win-win for both.
Exactly.
Amitendu, can I bring you in on this? I don't know if you caught some of the graphics that Ishan was talking to on the data, but in terms of simply on the tariffs front, do you think there's enough scope for give and take and everybody is a winner, or India will have to kind of take a step back on this?
I think there are two kinds of tariffs that we are looking at here. One is a set of generic tariffs. Let's say, for example, steel and aluminium, and the tariffs have already come. And as Trump has said, no exemptions, no exceptions. Everybody exporting to the United States will be facing those tariffs, irrespective of the tariffs they apply to the United States imports in their own country. Now, when those tariffs get compounded with another set of tariffs, which is country specific, the problem for the exporting country to the US becomes that much larger. I agree with the fact that there are items over which there will be give and take, but there are areas where I think India will face very tough calls. Our focus has been on Harley Davidson, on the machineries, on the manufacturing, so on and so forth. We are not talking about agricultural products, Nalin. And I think this is where there's going to be a significant amount of thinking that India will have to make and look in, particularly the dairy sector and the fruits and vegetable sector, where India will need to very seriously look at the possibility of bringing down tariffs, because those come from Trump constituencies, from Republican states in the United States. There are large chunks of these agricultural exporters who would want their access into the Indian market. So there is room for give and take. There is room for enough back and forth, but it's not going to be an easy process.
Right. Sanjeev, if we can hear Sanjeev. Sanjeev, we've lost the connection with Sanjeev. Shruti, the one word that was not used, the elephant in the room, was China. With China, there is a sense that Trump is being not as tough as a lot of people assumed he would be, that there is a lot more that meets the eye over here. What is your sense in terms of when he's talking about tariffs? And there are two issues with us, right? We have a border issue with China on the LSC. Right, and there is a larger security architecture issue. So where do you see this? And also there's an issue of China +1, where India has been trying to get the supply chain moved from China to India. Do you see this as a net positive after this visit, or do you think that it's a bit in the red on both these grounds?
I think, Nalin, the straight answer to that question is there has been ambiguity on what President Trump's China policy is going to look like. Now, if you, on the one hand, if you look at the people who are going to be making policy, whether it's the Secretary of State, Rubio, or Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, if you heard their confirmation hearings, it's very clear that they're very hawkish on China. But if you heard what the outgoing NSA Jake Sullivan said when, in his exit sort of briefing, he says, well, we'd want the US to continue on the path that has been laid out by the Biden administration on the China approach, because anything going back from it would essentially undo the lot of work that has been done in creating the emerging security architecture of the day. But I think what we have been seeing in terms of signs, especially with the trade and the tariff announcements, has been that what President Trump is trying to do is get a deal out of China and bring it to the negotiating table, which is not very different from what he did the first time around.
So Shruti, that's
you
correct.
also see
Shruti,
what he did with the recent controversy over TikTok.
Shruti, sorry to interrupt, but also what India's got is Tavur Rana, right? I mean, it's a long-standing demand. He was an FBI informant, and for the longest time, U.S. administrations have kind of stonewalled that. So, do you think that's a big win on the security side, which Modi can claim as a triumph?
Sure. I mean, I think terrorism and counterterrorism has been always very high up on the US-India sort of cooperation list. So that announcement and also the fact that the dehyphenation with Pakistan continues will be music to the ears at many, many people here, given the focus in the US on homeland security and how that sort of dovetails with the relationship going forward here with New Delhi are all good sort of takeaways from the meeting. So I think on the counterterrorism front, a lot of what he said on continuity in terms of Indo-Pacific priorities, what India is going to do with its Quad presidency, and the way India defines security within that Quad presidency, I think are all signs that we'll see more continuity and reassurance from the Trump administration rather than disruption.
The oil numbers. So, okay, thanks, Shruti. So, let me bring it back to the studio here with Ishan. Ishan, the last thing I want to talk about is the oil and gas relationship. Trump is saying that India is going to buy a lot more US oil. In terms of the pecking order right now, Russia is India's biggest oil supplier, has been for the last couple of years. And it's also been very controversial because after sanctions, after the Ukraine war, but India stuck to its policy. And India has been very upfront about it. Where does US fit in the suppliers list at the moment, if you can draw it out? And how do you see that changing and the impact of that on the trade deficit?
So, in December 2024, Russia was first, as you know, right? Saudi Arabia was there up at top, right? And surprisingly, Angola came in 5th, right? And US was 6th.
Right.
Now, in terms of why Trump is harping on oil and gas,
Iraq is also there somewhere, right, in the top 5.
Iraq is in the top 5, right? So US is 6th, Angola is 5th. This is for that month. Now, why US is harping on it? You look at 2015, right? And US was the second largest supplier to India, right? With Saudi on top, right? And Russia was far below. Now, in terms of barrels, if you look at it, and this is again a very interesting data point.
65 million barrels India gets
65
from the
million
US.
barrels. Now, when Trump came in, India was importing 140,000 barrels.
So let me just put this in context. From Russia, India has bought 165 million barrels, if I'm not wrong, in the last year. And from the US, it's bought 65 million.
Yes.
Right? So US is number 6. This is number 6. This is number 1. So what Trump is saying is bridge this gap as much as possible.
One, to get to the earlier point as well. So when Trump came in 2016, what India was importing from US in terms of 1,000 barrels per day was 140,000 barrels. He took that to 470,000 barrels per day.
Right.
Right. Which is 3.9% of US exports to about 6%. Now India has gone back.
So we went back to 3%. So
we
now
are back
Trump,
to 3%.
So if you bring back to what the old level was, then it's a win-win. So
exactly.
There is. So okay, Shruti, I know Shruti, you have to leave. So last comments from you, Shruti, on this, oil is power, and there've been books written, entire treatises written on how global politics is really about the politics of oil. What do you make of this?
Well, I think, all of what you've asked basically points, and to what Dr. Palit had said, that, there is, it's too early to sort of understand the ramifications and dub it as a win-win. I think what India did was Prime Minister Modi and his team were prepared for tariffs and transactions. So what you saw that India took a lot of its steps, even including with the budget, to align with sort of Trump's trade priorities. We have to be very clear that tariffs are going to be used as a tool in national security consultations and negotiations. So what India has managed to do is to create good impression with Trump to ensure that the smooth sailing continues, that the tide of ties and the continuity that we've achieved in the Indo-US relationship continues. Whether or not how much we pony up, if you will, and whether it's to that satisfaction, because with Trump the goal keep changing, is something that New Delhi will have to be very cautious about.
Thanks, Shruti. Amitendu, last words from you in terms of where India is going as an economy and where we need to be in terms of our developing needs. I think Modi made the point about how Viksit Bharat is really about making India great again. So in the larger economic vision and the larger trajectory that this government has set for itself, we're at 5-6% growth and growth has been slowing down. What do you see as the impact of this visit in that larger context?
I think on the whole, Nalin, it has been a significant visit because as we do realize, we are seeing a very different world today. It's not the world that was there 15, 20 years ago. This is the world where multipolarity is becoming extremely prominent and relationships are changing. Relationships are changing fast. India, like most other countries of the world, is very much aware of the importance of diversifying and putting its eggs in as many baskets as possible. But having said that, this kind of a complication in the world order, which comes with a direct association of trade policies with security interests, is something which in the in the existing world order is not a very common phenomenon. This is actually what we can say is weaponization. This is weaponization of economic advantage, and to a very large extent, the Trump administration is clearly weaponizing access to the American market as a very important national security tool. Now, this is something that India will need to be mindful of, and I will just quickly add a little point on the oil side, Nalin. The oil side is also significant from the point that trading with the United States in oil the implication is that you buy US oil in dollars. If you do it with a country like Russia, you pay in rupees. That arrangement has been worked out, which is a cheaper arrangement. So I think there are many sides to the relationship that we are seeing and the commitments that are being made. And overall, we are prepared for a world which is going to see much more inflation because of cascading tariffs. That's something which a country like India cannot be unaware of.
Right. Thanks very much, Amitendu, for making the time for us from Singapore. And we will, of course, keep coming back to you. And to Shruti, thanks very much. I know you had to go, so thanks for making the time. Both of you have been writing for Moneycontrol. Please do keep writing with your analysis on MC. And for all of you watching, we are doing 360-degree coverage of the India-US visit, of Modi's visit and his meeting with Trump. Keep logging on to moneycontrol.com for deep dives on what this means for the economy. Shan, thanks very much for joining us. Keep watching Money Control.